So when we talk about the female reproductive system, we have to talk about the series of cycles that are involved in the function of the female reproductive system. And that comes down to the menstrual cycle, which we can divide into the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle. So fundamentally, you have the maturation of an egg. That egg is released, and at the same time, there is this matured endometrium that will continue maturing to potentially be able to accept a fertilized egg and start the process of pregnancy. However, if a fertilized egg does not implant, then that endometrium and the egg will be shed in menstruation and the cycle will start again. Now, we'll talk a lot more about pregnancy next week, but looking at sort of the very early stage, what's important is once that egg is released, it's actually fertilized in the fallopian tubes and begins the development there, the first sets of division, and then it implants into the uterus as a blastocyst. What's important about that is not only sort of knowing when in the cycle that is and what that looks like, but also that there can be problems that cause it to implant in the fallopian tube, which is fundamentally essentially the same tissue as the uterus. And if that occurs, then that is very dangerous, and it's an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy outside of the uterus, and that has to be removed to save the mother's life. So let's zoom in on these ovaries. So ovaries is where this whole cycle starts. In the ovaries, you have a set of primordial follicles. A person with ovaries is born with all the primordial follicles that they will have for their whole life, and every month from puberty until menopause, some of those primordial follicles will develop into primary follicles. Generally, a few of them are going to develop at this point, and this initial development, when it will occur, then you'll have an oocyte, so this actual egg surrounded by a secondary follicle. So this is fully developed. It'll be developed. One of these will develop every month. And then the oocyte itself, not the follicle remaining, will ovulate, will be released, break through the outer membrane of the ovary and be released. And then the remaining follicle will stay behind as the corpus luteum, releasing hormones, and then degenerate into the corpus albicans. So we can look at that along with what's happening in the uterus. So here's our primary follicle, that early development, and that actually starts during the menstruation part of the cycle. So when the uterine lining is being shed. So that uterine lining is shed, the ovary develops the secondary follicle, and that's happening about the time that menstrual phase is ending. And then the proliferative phase happens where it starts to build up. And at this point, we have the vesicular follicle that's forming this vesicle with the independent oocyte inside that can be ovulated. And the proliferation continues until about ovulation, at which point it switches over to the secretory phase. So the secretory phase, the lining has built up and it is starting to secrete the things that it would potentially need to maintain an implanted embryo. So if this embryo implants, the uterus will be ready. And the corpus luteum is there sending out hormones to maintain this. But then the corpus luteum regresses and the corpus albicans starts to decay and the hormones aren't being sent out anymore. And as those hormones go down, then we re-enter the menstrual phase. Now, the development of the oocyte that we're looking at here. So we start, this is a meiotic process, right? So we're going to wind up with a haploid cell. But we start with the development of these primordial follicles. And this is a mitotic process. So we're developing these primordial follicles, these 2N cells. At birth, we have a set number of these primordial follicles that are going to be staying there, this primary oocyte, primordial follicle. And then every month from puberty until menopause, one will be prepared and ovulated. Now, what happens here, so here's our primary follicle growing, we're still arrested, there's no division happening. And then as ovulation is happening, the next division occurs. And this divides down to have, so we're dividing this and we're producing a polar body. This polar body is just a waste product. We're just going to get rid of that polar body. Now, the final division, going down to an actual haploid nucleus, doesn't actually happen unless the oocyte is fertilized. If the oocyte is fertilized, once that sperm enters, the final division happens. The second polar body is produced. The original polar body may or may not divide. It's not really important. We don't need to worry about it here. But our second polar body is produced, and then the two haploid nuclei will combine to produce a new diploid cell. Now, this process of ovulation can go wrong, and what happens here, what we're looking at PCOS, which is called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So polycystic comes from these line of cysts where there are multiple immature follicles, they're not ovulated, and they stick around as cysts and disrupt the hormonal balance. These cysts are continuing to produce some hormones, throwing off the balance. There's generally high levels of androgens being produced, and this can lead to symptoms associated with the high levels of androgen, like hair growth in places. This can lead to weight gain. This can lead to diabetes. So there's a whole lot of issues associated with the hormones being produced by these cysts. So hormones, that's the key thing here. Let's come back to these hormones. Now, all these are hormones we've talked about before, but I said when we were in the hormone system that we were just going to kind of glaze over this cycle because there's a lot going on. Now we really need to focus in on it. So the hypothalamus is producing GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's going to be pretty stable, although it's downregulated by estrogen, so we'll see some cycling of that. But gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to stimulate the production of FSH and LH. However, in the female, these are also affected by other hormones that are circulating around and are going to make this more complicated. So FSH is going to stimulate the follicle. It's follicle stimulating hormone. That's what it does. And that's where that name comes from. So it stimulates the follicle, and the ovarian follicle then starts maturing when it responds to FSH. And that maturing follicle is going to produce estrogen. Now, estrogen is going to have conflicting effects on FSH and LH. Estrogen is going to slow down the production of FSH, preventing additional follicles from maturing. But it's going to start the production of LH, which is luteinizing hormone. Now, you may see the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone is going to activate this ovulation process. So luteinizing hormone causes ovulation. Then the corpus luteum produces progesterone, and progesterone is going to slow down the production of LH. And at the same time, progesterone is also preparing the uterus. So this is signaling the uterus to ramp up and get ready and go into that secretory phase. Now, when the corpus luteum degenerates, then the estrogen and progesterone levels are going to fall, and that fall signals menstruation, but it also allows FSH to start building up again, which is then going to cause the maturation of another ovarian follicle. So hormonal contraception acts on this by blocking this cycle by bringing in exogenous from the outside estrogen and sometimes progesterone. So those are going to then block the production of FSH and LH, preventing this whole ovulatory cycle. So we're back in this ovary, looking at this cycle. So we put all of these pieces together. And then we have ovulation, and this oocyte is going to leave the ovary and go out into the fallopian tube, the uterine tube. So the uterine tube here, we have a muscular wall, and then we have this epithelium, and then we have this lumen. So this epithelium is a secretory epithelium to produce the things that the oocyte is going to need to survive as it goes along, until it reaches the uterus. So the uterus also has that secretory epithelium, but it's got this thick muscular wall. Now the fallopian tube also had some muscle that was pushing the egg along with the cilia pushing the egg along. But so when it gets to this uterus, then we have that whole secretory epithelium, but we have this very thick muscular wall, which is of course important during labor for pushing the baby out, and also during menstruation for pushing out this lining, because the old lining needs to get out of the uterus so that it doesn't basically rot in the body. So we push out the uterine lining there, and this activates, of course, the same muscles that labor does, pushing that out. That's what cramps are. All right, so we're back. We've got this cycle. Everything's coming together with the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, and we have that whole process. So the uterine cycle, we can look at this, the details of what's going on here. So during menses, there's the shedding of this entire surface of the uterus. So this isn't just, we think about blood, this is epithelial cells, this is secretory cells, and this whole endometrial zone that is being lost, shedding these secretory cells. Then these build back up every month until we have the secretory phase where these are fully built and secreting what an embryo would need if it were to be fertilized and preparing to implant. So we can look at the hormonal cycle here. So the hormonal cycle, so we'll start here. We've got the initial follicle. So we have FSH and LH being produced here. We have the initial follicle start secreting estrogen. And this is going to stimulate this surge. And we'll see this drop here at the same time. So then we've got this surge, and then we have this boost where follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone are going to boost up to ovulation, and then that is going to, that will be ovulated. The corpus luteum then will begin to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which then suppresses luteinizing hormone, and to a lesser degree suppresses the follicle stimulating hormone. And that will also signal for this activation of the secretory phase. And then we get the degeneration, where the corpus luteum degenerates, it stops secreting hormone, and then that brings back to the menstrual phase, where we get this drop in estrogen and progesterone. This continues until menopause, at which point the ovary runs out of functioning follicles to prepare and build up, at which point the cycle ceases. And when the cycle ceases, then estrogen and progesterone go down. The vagina tends to contract, the uterus contracts, the cervix actually opens up a little bit, it becomes less tight, it's tightly bound here. It's no longer preparing for pregnancy.